It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jason Spangler, IVI's CEO, and Dr. Rick Chapman, Chief Science Officer here at IVI.
Thank you, Tiffany. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see everybody. We have a great number of folks joining this Methods Summit today, and I'm excited for several reasons. One is this is my third month as CEO, and this is my first big event. So that's very exciting. And I'm just excited to be part of the efforts that we as a team are undertaking when it comes to addressing value and innovation. And I think many of you know we are known for our Methods Summit. And so we're excited about this third annual Methods Summit focusing on innovation and how you value it. These Methods Summits are focusing on identifying the complex challenges within value assessment and HTA and kind of exploring opportunities to improve them incrementally, to come to consensus on definitions and how we move forward, and really to try to improve the processes and methods around value assessment and HTA. Just to remind everyone, IVI is a member-supported organization, so we're glad that all of our members that are on this Methods Summit and just the support they provide. And just wanted to note that this summit is part of a larger project on valuing innovation, and we're very thankful for the support that Pharma has provided, the trade association. So thank you for that. Also wanted to thank our co-chairs. We have an amazing pair of gentlemen who are co-chairs, Michael Graglia from SynGap Research Fund and Josh Krieger from the Harvard Business School. I've been on a few calls with these gentlemen, and I learn something new every single time that I'm on these calls. And so it's great to have them co-chairing this overall project. You're going to hear them later moderating a couple of the sessions. So you're going to learn stuff from them as well, and from just the great number of panelists we have from the different sessions today. So thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Rick, who's going to go over the objectives and the format for the rest of the summit. So thank you.
Thanks, Jason. And I just wanted to add my welcome to Jason's to everybody, and thank you for attending today. So what do we hope to accomplish today during this summit? We're going to talk about innovation and ways to measure innovation. And you're going to hear from different stakeholders who have different perspectives on what they mean by innovation. But we're hoping that at the end of the day, we can come together and have some areas of consensus or agreement around some aspects of innovation, how we should measure that across the different stakeholders. We're also hoping to look at some existing value assessment methods that are being used for health technology assessment and see what are the strengths and limitations of those methods in terms of capturing innovation and incentivizing innovation and how can we make that more useful for decision makers, whether those are patients, clinicians, payers, or purchasers. We're also going to talk about some of the different approaches that have been suggested for ways to measure innovation that may not be in traditional health technology assessments. And we'd like to talk about, which of those approaches are most promising, which ones should we really lean in on and prioritize in terms of research, and where are there areas where we really need to step back and maybe think a little harder about, are we capturing that innovation? Do we really know how to capture that innovation? And then I think there's areas where we have to think about, are we double counting? Are we really separating out independent aspects of innovation so that we can measure those and make sure that we've got a comprehensive but fair assessment of the innovation of new products? So a pretty ambitious agenda and objectives, but I'm hopeful that during the course of the day we can make some headway here, and look forward to hearing from our speakers and hearing the questions from the audience. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jason.
Thanks, Rick, for that. We're going to start off the summit today with actually talking about kind of a vision for how you value innovation. And we're very honored to have Mark Trusheim from NewDigs as our speaker for that. And this is going to be a dialogue, a chat between Mark and I, less of a lecture. And so glad to have Mark, particularly because he's been traveling recently. So we're very honored and privileged to have him join us. So I think most of you know Mark, but if not, he's the strategic director at NewDigs, which was formerly at MIT and now is at Tufts Medical Center. He co-leads their FOCUS project, which is financing and reimbursement of cures in the US. He's also a visiting scientist at the MIT Sloan School of Management. And he's also served as a special government employee at the FDA's Office of the Commissioner through MIT. Mark has kind of spanned, a lot of different things in his career. His research now focuses on the economics of biomedical innovation. So it's going to be great to get his thoughts, focusing particularly on precision financing for patient access, precision medicine, trials, biosimilars, digital health. So, and his career has spanned kind of big data, marketing in the biopharma area, even e-health as part of Monsanto Health Solutions, genomics as the president of a genomics company, and policy as the president of the Massachusetts Biotech Council. So Mark has such a wide range of expertise. And again, it's just great to have you here, Mark. So welcome as we start this chat.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction and reinforcing to everyone that I can't seem to hold a job for more than a few years in any various place. But the last 15 years, I have been concentrating on value in precision medicines, in the new cell and gene therapies that have durable effects, and just in the biopharma value chain from discovery through loss of exclusivity generally. So it's exciting to be with everyone here today. And Jason, thank you so much for conceiving of this project moving forward and gathering so many phenomenal speakers all together here today. And I'm sure a very distinguished group that I can hardly wait to see their questions.
Great, thanks, Mark. And I don't think that you can't hold a job. I just think you're in high demand. That's how I would look at it. So
you see, that's why I didn't spend very much time in marketing. I just don't have your spend. Thanks, Jason.
So we have about 20 minutes to solve all the issues around value innovation. So why don't we get started with that? Just seriously, this is a really important topic, particularly as we see innovation moving very rapidly, and we're trying to keep up when it comes to how to determine value, how to figure out financing and payment. And so it's great that we're having this conversation today. Let me start with this question. Our discussion about value innovation, how have you seen it changed over the last, say, 5 years? And what do you think some of the drivers of the changes in that discussion?
Oh, great opening question. And 5 years ago, we were all talking about what are the general areas that ought to be talked about when we think about value. This poor value flower hadn't come through yet with all its new petals or areas of potential value thinking. So there was just a much more narrow view longer ago. And then also when we got multiple stakeholders together, they would all sort of talk from their own perspective only, without a lot of understanding of how the other constituents, whether patients didn't understand the challenges that payers faced. Payers didn't always understand the challenges that developers faced. Providers always felt a little caught in the middle, and that no one really understood what it took to actually deliver care anymore. So I think we've really moved now to a space where everyone recognizes that patients have to come first in all conversations, which is really a huge shift in perspective, that all the players agree that there is one constituent, patients, that has to come first. But we've also now recognized that all the other stakeholders also have to be sustainable. And so it's not just whatever is possible for patients, but what's ever appropriate for patients. That's a really important distinction, and that payers have recognized that they actually do want the continued flow of biopharmaceuticals, so they want that biopharma industry to remain sustainable and producing these new transformative therapies going forward. And I think that's contributed to this shift, as well as that the new therapies coming forward have been extraordinarily impactful for the patient's quality of life compared to perhaps 20, 30, 40 years ago, where not only were they perhaps longer impact therapies for heart disease, where if you waited 20 years, you would see an impact, right, on cardiovascular deaths. But here, we've got nearly instantly transformative therapies for patients, and they're often in very small populations, and have been coming with impacts and value, particularly for children, that affect their caregivers and then their parents, as well as their own innate ability to lead normal lives, and then become great contributors to society going forward. So that's what's really been different. Now, we still talk past each other, and we're simply because we recognize the forces doesn't mean we figured out how to resolve them yet. But uh, the movement has turned from what are we even talking about to now, I think, much more specific conversations of how do we balance the tensions, and we know what those tensions are. And it's been driven by these durable cell therapies, the advances in cancer, the new rare disease, orphan disease kinds of therapies, and the anti-infectives as well have really driven this forward. Things like hepatitis C that were a sort of a negative shock to payers, caught them by surprise, and sort of the positive shock we've had with the COVID vaccines coming forward so quickly.
No, that's great, Mark. Thank you. You mentioned some of the learnings, and you implied that those learnings might not be applied in the way that they should be. Can you address that a little bit? Do you think some of the learnings are being applied, and how? And if not, how do you think they should be applied?
Well, some of the learnings, for example, around how do we measure good outcomes and the impact of innovation. We've seen tremendous advances in some therapeutic areas, such as in cancer, where there's a continuing emphasis on both overall survival, but how good are some of the intermediate endpoints that are more tractable to measure in the shorter term. I won't get into all the various debates, because whatever I say, someone will be not happy with one of the surrogate metrics. But even payers, as I'm seeing in outcomes contracting discussions, because of patient mobility issues in the United States, are getting very practical as opposed to theoretical about these issues, and saying, we're going to see a cancer patient for 2-3 years. We can't wait for a 5-year overall survival number. What should we be using? Payers and developers and patients are also getting practical for how do we measure these outcomes? Yes, registries are great, but they can be very costly, and they can help research a great deal. But maybe we can resolve some of these value discussions on individual products by seeing how the claims data shows differences in, are they taking other therapies or not, if it was supposed to be transformative. For the SMA product, they went to, is the child on ventilation or not, because that was the normal progression of the disease. So if the new therapy really arrested the progression of that disease, we shouldn't see the child go onto ventilation. So there are people being much more practical about what we've learned, and also a huge openness to now thinking about impacts on caregivers, impacts on scientific spillovers, and what's the value of those? What's the value for employers for presenteeism, particularly in the United States, where employers are paying for about half the healthcare in the United States? Those kind of very practical benefits are part of how we now talk about the value of the innovation and the value of the impacts on patients, not just the healthcare costs. Once we assess that value, there's still huge debates about who gets to share what fraction of that value. How much should go to the patient? How much should the payers see? How much should the developers of these new transformative therapies participate? Are those the kind of directions you'd like to go, Jason, or do you want to redirect me here a bit?
No. I think that's great. You're addressing a lot of the questions that we want to talk about today. So you're hitting all the marks. Let me take that a little further. You talked about some areas of how to assess value that we're thinking about more now than we have been in the past. And you mentioned that some aspects or some stakeholders want to emphasize one more than other. Do you think there are potential areas of agreement between the stakeholders about how we value innovation?
So the short answer is yes. but there is still debate about then how we allocate some of that value. And on a practical level, going forward, I think it is showing up in a shift from paying for the promise of benefits to more outcomes driven sorts of approaches that we've been seeing. That there's a recognition again of secondary impacts on caregivers, which then has impacts on how children and their families fall into poverty or can't escape poverty, and therefore have broader social benefits usage than others. So the conversation is really broad. Developing the evidence and the data for those still remains a huge challenge, and taking it from concept to, again, this practical, how do we turn it into what's the value of a therapy, and then how do we divide that therapy amongst folks, I think is still a great challenge. And if we don't hit it right, we're going to see difficulties where therapies may not come forward. I'd remind everyone that while we're excited by the kinds of vaccines we've seen come forward from COVID, we have 3 or 4 that are phenomenal right now. I'd remind everyone that we're about somewhere between 30 and 70, depending how one counts, different vaccines that were in development, of which we now have a handful, right? So it wasn't just a straight line from things. So there was a lot of experimentation and failure. And that in the 90s, we in the US almost exited the vaccines business because we couldn't agree on how to value them, right? So nearly all the US players in the vaccine business exited or came very close to exiting until we changed some of the incentive challenges, and which meant how do we value them and how were we willing to pay the innovators for maintaining vaccine capacity within the United States. And that took real changes, not in the upstream science, but in the downstream incentives and reimbursement processes. And that's where, again, where I think we're seeing the most challenge today is not the theory, but how do we make it practical and implementable, and how do we collect the data and put in the payment mechanisms, what we call precision reimbursement at NewDigs, and the use of real world evidence to drive that precision reimbursement, and then still learn going forward about what are all the subpopulations that work well, which again in COVID, we're seeing long COVID, we're seeing different populations that are having better effects and some that have some challenges or side effects. So we have to keep learning beyond just very large clinical trials. And I think that's all part of this transformation, which real world evidence and the new technology changes that we're seeing are really helping with, even though we have scale problems today.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. And you kind of segued into the next part that we wanted to discuss, and that's going from kind of valuing innovation to how do you incentivize innovation? And you touched that, a little bit already. I'm just wondering, any other challenges that you think around incentivizing innovation? And what about, are there specific challenges to the stakeholders that we've already mentioned? So are there particular challenges maybe for patients versus payers versus investors and even other stakeholders, but any other kind of challenges besides what you already mentioned about how to incentivize innovation?
We seem to be biased towards incentivizing phenomenal scientific discoveries and then muddling through the incentives for the development for the investors and the innovative companies going forward. But we haven't incentivized as much innovations in the use of these new innovations and products. So helping providers get real world understanding of, for the patient in front of me, how well is this therapy going to work? Or if I'm in equipoise that I've got 4 different therapeutic options, which one might I lead with other than the last 3 patients that I've seen and what sort of worked for them? So providers and patients, I think, have this real a challenge of how to select and therefore which is going to be the most valuable therapy for them moving forward. And we certainly have not incentivized payment in innovation. I mean, the durable therapies that came forward, this was not a new problem for the world, that you had a high upfront cost and that maybe the benefits were going to be viewed over many years. In housing, we called it buying a house and you had a mortgage, right? In healthcare, we called it a payment crisis, and we didn't know how to deal and match these new durable therapies where, lo and behold, if you don't just rent every month or every quarter through a therapy fee called the price for the script, we didn't know how to pay for these transformative therapies up front. And yet from an economics and finance standpoint, paying over time and then dealing with uncertainties of how long it would be durable with sort of a these things we do in bond markets all the time with early redemptions of bonds and how you handle those sorts of issues and have discounts and rebates, et cetera, for that was all phenomenally new thoughts 5 years ago. And now we're seeing them beginning to be implemented, but it's taken us 5 years for that. Then it'll probably take another five years to work out all the mechanics where it just becomes normal operating processes as opposed to a huge special activity every time.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I'm in complete agreement with that. When we talk about specific stakeholders, and you mentioned patients first previous in this conversation, do you see that patients are being consulted about this? It seems like in the past or historically, we've kind of we've talked about the patient perspective, but we haven't actually brought patients in. Do you see that is happening more now? And does no more need to be done in that area?
So I see it phenomenally different than it was certainly 10 years ago. And I think even in the couple years before COVID, where now patients have a seat at the table, all right? Oftentimes, everything from what should the research areas and targets look like to how should the trials be developed to what are the metrics that ought to be used. Increasingly, the patient voice is being brought in. But it's still too often the patient voice by anecdote and testimonial, as opposed to the patient voice by data that can be juxtaposed against other types of data. So I know in our trying to assess a value for a particular therapeutic, I and some other health economists were in various forums with government officials and agencies. And I remember a couple meetings where, yes, we listened to the patient voice and we're going to hear it come in. But I asked, so if our analytical numbers show a certain result for a therapy and the patients give us all this story that, well, it's really much more valuable than what your numbers are showing, are we going to ever raise our numbers to increase that? And I got giggles from around the table, right? Well, our numbers are our numbers, and this is contextual for the decision makers to be using. So I think we have this challenge of converting the patient voice into quantified evidence as opposed to qualitative evidence that is helpful around the edges, but doesn't actually change the quantitative value that we place on any of these therapies going forward. And I think that's our hope for the next 5 or 10 years, from patient-reported outcomes to more quantitative natural history studies to just broader population studies of how diseases and then the benefits of the therapies really flow through. We have to change these incredible stories of transformed lives into quantified numbers that we can, just actually add to the value out of our classic sorts of economic analyses that we do in this.
Yeah, no, great. That sounds great. Yeah, and totally agree. Again, we have about 5 minutes left. I want to just cover 2 questions. So I'm gonna give them both, but you can address them, how you would like. You mentioned NUDIGs, and I did not mention in the beginning what that stands for. For those who don't know, that stands for New Drug Development Paradigms. And you talked a little bit about what you're doing around precision financing and work related to that. But I just wanted to give you just maybe a minute or two to talk about with the work that NewDigs is doing, what do you think's the next important area to get kind of consensus on that, and where are you working to actually come, to get that consensus from all the stakeholders? And then what I also want you to be thinking about, and maybe you can weave this in, is we talked about the last 5 years, but what do you think the challenges are going to be kind of in the next 5 years, and then maybe even longer, 10 to 20 years, and how will we know if we're getting things right? So I know that's a lot in 4 to 5 minutes, but answer
Well, we'll
that
see
as
how
best
good
you
I am at answering 4 questions in 60 seconds now that I've become an academic and verbose, but we'll see. So thanks for the opportunity to give a little bit of a plug for our new drug development paradigms program, which we call NewDigs. It's moved from MIT to Tufts in the last year, where we are really stewards of multi-stakeholder consortium that are looking to do healthcare systems change. So that patients have access to these transformative new therapies coming forward of whatever type. Where we have been emphasizing is the connection of evidence development over time and changing binary decisions of, do I get a coverage decision? Do I get a regulatory decision? Is yes, no at one point in time, to really understanding all therapies have uncertainty, which we're trying to reduce over time. And so we need to think of evidence development as being a collaborative effort by all. Patients, the developers, the providers who do it, the payers who are paying for it, are all generating data. And that data has some information content. It would be great if everything was an experiment, but that's not the case. But there are tools to extract information from the real world setting as well as from RCTs, and then to combine those. So our multi-stakeholder consortium are looking to, over the next 5 or 10 years, how do we combine that real world evidence and classic evidence and continued coordinated communication from patients and payers to developers and regulators, so that there's a connected roadmap over time for both evidence and then the kind of payment innovation that matches that. So these there's more surety as to which products are wanted, which products are going to get to market, and how do we value those over time, which we think can only be done together in collaborations. And it has to be practical, where, again, patients come first, but all the constituents have to be sustainable through this, and then make it practical. So that's what we're about at NewDigs. We're concentrating at the moment on what we call a LEAPS program, a learning ecosystem, and then our financing of cures. The 2 big concepts are RWE and precision reimbursement and how they connect. So thanks for that. Now, you wanted me to talk again about—
Yeah, you have about 30 seconds, Mark.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry to get long-winded. You got me excited about what we do. I think it's about really creating the mechanisms by which we pay for outcomes and we understand who's really benefiting, and having that flow all the way back into the system, as well as the forward push from the scientific innovation, that these 2 things become connected and anticipated, as opposed to separate afterthoughts, with patient values and their broader impacts really rising to the fore to all of this, as opposed to more easily measured what was the cost on provider billings through all this. So that's where I hope we're heading.
Yeah, no, that's great. And you did it in time. So thank you. This has been a great conversation, Mark. Thanks. An excellent kind of framework as we think about these large issues and this bigger topic around valuing innovation. So thanks for kind of setting that up for us, and the vision for that. So a lot to think about, a lot to work on, and thanks again for your time. And we look forward to partnering with you moving forward. So it's great.
Thanks so much. I'm going to answer a couple questions that I see came through. I'll do that in the chat box.
We appreciate that. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to turn it over now to Mike Ragley. As I said earlier, he's one of our co-chairs on this overall project, and he's going to lead a discussion on different perspectives on valuing innovation. So thank you, Mark, and turn it over to you, Mike. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So if I could ask my panelists to join me up here, that would be great. This is the Perspectives on the Value of Innovation. My name is Mike Graglia. I am a father of a child with a rare neurological disease called SYNGAP1. 4.5 years ago, my wife and I created the SYNGAP Research Fund, which you can see behind me. And my background right now is an ICD-10 code we got a year ago, primarily because we were worried about valuing innovations that we made for SYNGAP1. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart, and I'm honored to be hosting this panel and I look forward to learning a lot from the incredible panelists that we have with us. I'm just going to quickly introduce them all. I'm going to point you to the website for their bios because I could spend half the session reading off their various accomplishments, and I'd rather hear from them. We have Leah Howard from the National Psoriasis Foundation. Thank you for being here. We're going to have Michelle McMurray-Heath from the Biotech Innovation Organization, or BIO, who I think is coming from another meeting, so we'll probably be joining shortly. Lynette Demers from the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME, and Walt Kotonik from Third Rock Ventures. From Third Rock Ventures, who is a VC on the who I've known for a little while, and I cannot wait to hear from. So let me jump in and offer each speaker an introductory question. This is a truly exceptional panel. I'm no doubt we're going to learn a lot from them, and I would encourage you guys to riff off each other and comment. I think this is going to be great. Leah, if you don't mind, let me start with you. As a patient advocate myself, and speaking to a patient advocate from a much larger organization, I'm excited to ask you this question. How do you think patient communities such as yours come into this conversation about innovation? I mean, I'm personally grateful to IVI for having me here so I can learn, but how do you come in? And do you believe that patient perspectives and goals are served by the status quo for how innovation and technologies is being measured now, or emerging?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, for letting me kick this off, and thank you to Jason and Jennifer for including me and the NPF in this conversation. And I'm so glad that this panel's following Mark's remarks this morning, because I really enjoyed kind of the brief bit of the conversation about the way patient inclusion in this conversation has really shifted. And, I really appreciated that he began his remarks by talking about the fact that the patient needs to come first. I think those of us that work in the patient space certainly know that, but I very much appreciated him framing that as a key part of the shift that's happened in the last few years. I would agree, though, with what he said at the end of his remarks about the fact that patient perspectives have often been included in more of that anecdotal and testimonial way, not with data. So I think I would give a couple of thoughts here on your question, Mike, about how we come at this conversation about innovation from a patient perspective. First, I would say, I think we have historically approached including patients in the conversation of value related to innovation in a very siloed way. And we've done that from a couple of different perspectives. I think one is viewing patients as having a common, shared, singular perspective. And I think, many times folks fall into the trap of thinking about the patient community within any patient community as this really homogenous group, when in fact, those of us that are in the patient community and work with patient communities know they have incredibly varied perspectives and want very different things. And so I think we oftentimes take one patient perspective or that one anecdotal testimonial to be representative of all patients, when in fact, we need to go out and gather the data that really reflects the entirety of the patient experience. That being said, of course, there are many areas where patients do want the same things. Patients want to see a robust pipeline. Patients want to be able to afford new therapies. So there are those common areas of interest, but we should not fall into the trap of considering patient perspectives in a siloed way. I'd say secondly, I think historically we have brought in the patient perspective in really limited settings and kind of made those a once and done conversation, and then check that box. Okay, we got patient perspectives on this topic. And I would remind people, just as, when you're in your 40s and 50s, you don't have the same perspectives on things that you did when you were in your teens and 20s. Patients' perspectives change over time. And so we really need to be engaging patient communities regularly in an ongoing way through a continuous conversation about value and innovation so that as patient perspectives change, we are able to adjust our understanding of their perspective in this conversation about value. Finally, I would say, I think in many areas of healthcare, there are winners and losers, and we need to be careful that patients aren't always in that loser category where the responsibility is falling on patients to either gather the data or prove the point about what they need when it comes to innovation, because at the end of the day, that's not going to serve any of us well. Look forward to the discussion.
So busy writing down everything you said, forgetting I'm supposed to be moderating. That was wonderful. Thank you. And I agree wholeheartedly. Michelle, I'm so glad you could join us from Bio. The question I wanted to ask you is, what do you think, how do you think about valuing innovation, and what are the implications of how we measure and reward innovation for health equity?
Of course. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and I apologize for being a few minutes late. I was on another panel that ran over as well. So first of all, this is such an important conversation because we have to be putting value in the context of what it means to patients. It's meaningless to say therapy has a certain value if that's not how the patient who's going to receive the therapy actually places value on it. So it seems obvious, but it's important to restate because I think our policymakers continue to forget that over and over again. Now that also means, and Leah alluded to this, covering the waterfront, the landscape of the types of patients that can benefit from a therapy. We have to make sure that just as through the life course, your values change, different communities, different socioeconomic groups may place value on different things. And we have to make sure that any value assessment tool that we're using is also paying attention to those variations and reflecting those in the methodology. That's critically important. The other thing we continually discount is the overall lifespan and point of view of patients with chronic disease. I think there is a lot of derision and discounting of what those patients feel is most valuable in some of the methodology that we see used often. We talk about QALYs, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We really need to make sure that patients who are disabled, patients who've been fighting a chronic disease for quite some time, patients who have exhausted the other commonly used clinical options may have a very different value system for new therapy than a policymaker sitting in a office in DC. So that is very important to remember as well. Hard to do, but important to address.
Yes, and I would add just briefly, there's also diseases like my son has where the whole family's, the caregivers and the whole family is really diagnosed and affected, and capturing those impacts and their perspectives is huge. But let me go to Lynette from DIME. And I'm just coming back from a meeting that was all about digital biomarkers. So I'm really looking forward to asking you this question, and I think you're still muted. But Lynette, how are we doing at measuring benefit and cost benefit of emerging technologies in this digital area, which is sort of right on the incredibly innovative? And what, if anything, is getting in the way?
Oh my gosh, that's such a big question. All right, so if you're not familiar with the Digital Medicine Society, we're also a member-supported nonprofit that does really action-oriented projects in the space of digital medicine. And we're very interested, of course, in part of our, it is our tagline is the equitable, effective, ethical, and safe development and deployment of digital medicine products. So I mean, we work really from the very beginning of new digital biomarker development that can be used in support of clinical studies, all the way through to looking at how to deploy these tools in healthcare. So, I mean, the question, how are we doing in valuing those innovations? I mean, I think that the field is so new, and it's come, I mean, the pandemic has really been sort of a watershed, right, to show that we can use these tools in practice, decentralized and digitized trials. It's also, I would say probably explosive growth might be an understatement, but holy smokes, we're really out over our skis in many cases. And when sort of the things we can do very, very well are measure such things as engagement, are patients using these tools. What we can't, or we don't have the frameworks yet for measuring, are some of those things I think that digital does very, very well, or has the opportunity to do very well, that actually the other panelists in the previous session spoke of. Can we now quantitatively measure things that matter to patients? An example I give is we just wrapped up at Dime a project on digital biomarkers for atopic dermatitis for a specific measure, nocturnal scratching. So this is a patient behavior that you would measure passively, and it is profoundly impactful on patients' lives, and something that complements existing measures. But what are the unintended consequences of measuring such a thing? Down the road, could it be used to limit access to drugs? How can we make sure that we've got equitable access to technology? So you're thinking immediately, does it require Wi-Fi? Does everybody have Wi-Fi? So those types of things are huge issues. But I think we don't have the frameworks. I mean, you guys talk a lot about sort of the existing ISPOR flowers, and I was preparing for this meeting, looking at the value of diagnostic information. A lot of digital products are diagnostics, right? In a way, they're giving us new data streams, and data streams in a continuous and often passive way to understand more about what's going on in patients' sort of lived experience of their disease. So the impact there are, of course, how are patients really experiencing their disease? So huge potential there. But also some of the impacts of these continuous data really are some sort of what we call structural and procedural effects, such as care coordination, such as equitable access, things that we have not even thought about how to bake into our value frameworks, but are profoundly impactful when it comes to actually delivering care and getting value of it, right? So are patients engaged in their care? That's a stupid word. Are they participating? Are they empowered are they learning skills? We do not know how to measure these things. We do not know how to value them yet. And I think, this is really blasted onto the scene and need to be able to incorporate that. So a lot of these digital tools will be adjuncts associated with new therapies coming down the road, right? And so to be able to incorporate that thinking, how do patients experience their disease? How can we help measure that quantitative way? This is a real promise. Another thought on this is, holy smokes, when these new tools are deployed in clinical practice, right now I just saw some data that showed 0.1% of all of physicians are using the remote patient monitoring claims codes. So basically we're not tracking. And when we do track them, physicians don't really know who those tools really apply for. So it's 0.001% of physicians or something, I actually forget the data, but who actually use these codes and apply it to all their patients. And then when we look in the claims data, the codes are not granular enough. So we cannot attribute the impact of these technologies to the intervention. So there's a lot of lags, and I'm sort of touching on a lot of thoughts here. I definitely encourage you guys, I'm going to put some links in the chat. I'm really curious what this field thinks about some work that the German Ministry of Health did with Dime on sort of new frameworks in valuing, and they have a expedited regulatory and reimbursement pathway for low risk digital. That it really does start to say we need to value these things. Doesn't put a framework in place, but it's really interesting. I'll put some links in. I'll stop there.
I have so many thoughts. And it is 7:45 in the morning here, so kids are going to school on the side, and I'm like, I'm on the phone. But I mean, one of the things I would say, just to immediately respond to, I am living through so much of what you're talking about right now. In terms of, people are coming to me with these incredible tools, and then I turn around to biopharma partners and clinicians, and they're like, that's sci-fi, we do it just fine. Or another thing I've heard is, that's a really cool tool, and even if it worked, the FDA wouldn't care. because what they're regulating and what they're measuring is, you know, very 20th century, if not 19th. And so, you know, that's great that there's this innovation, but the existing regulatory framework doesn't even start to touch it. And as somebody who's sitting in the middle of trying to care for a kid and being tantalized by these digital tools that I learn about as a patient advocate, the thinking about how we could actually deploy them and use them to build a bridge between clinician and patient, as opposed to create something else for them to disagree about, I can talk for hours. And then Michelle, on the equity side, right? How do we use these tools to increase equity and broaden and make the tent bigger, as opposed to make it something else that some people have and some people don't? So but I'm just supposed to be moderating, so I'll shut up. I want to make sure we hear from Walt, who, you know, sees these technologies, gets people coming to him and tries to start companies and tries to think about how value will come out. So the question for you, Walt, is as an investor, like, what are you looking for in health innovation? How do you think about everything that's been said? Plus, you know, what are the signs that a technology is going to be able to capture value from your perspective?
First, Mike, thanks for inviting me to participate. Great to see you. Great to have this conversation. You know, my answer to your question is maybe cliche, right? We look for opportunities to make a really big difference in people's lives. I think you nailed it as well, that, you know, what is going on with your son is also impacting your whole family. So I say that deliberately. It's people's lives, not only patients. Of course, patients are the central part of that. For what I do, largely therapeutics, investing in drug discovery around therapeutics, you know, we are often looking for, on day one, the opportunity, the biologic rationale for why we can make a big difference in someone's life. We look to people like you, Mike, and the patient community and the families to help us understand what that looks like quantitatively. Sometimes it's easy, right? There's a beautiful Nature Medicine publication from this past summer that showed that patients with SMA who are diagnosed early and get on therapy hit their typically developing motor milestones. We got it. That one works, right? Like that is a great sign of when the system works. We should pay for that therapy. Value has been met. I think it's hard. So for me, and particularly what I do, being a very, very early stage investor, it's about connecting the dots between, does biology suggest we will really be able to intercept this disease pathology? And then can I talk to someone like you, Mike, like the folks on this panel, to really help me understand what that would look like? And is there any hope of quantifying that so regulators and payers will get on board?
Got it. Okay. I mean, I could push you, Walt, and you
should.
I mean, well, okay. Let me just push you a little bit. You're an early stage investor, so are you basically thinking someone else is going to buy out my stake and they're going to have to worry about capturing value in the marketplace? Or like when you are seeing a technology that is, the biology is there in its early stage, you're like, this could really make a difference. When does it factor into your thinking or the thinking of the board and the executive team that you put in place? This is so novel, or does this conversation come up? This is so novel. How are we going to even, like, this is a therapy for a disease that doesn't have an ICD-10 code. Or how are we going to get payers to pay for something that is conceptually one shot, and the course of a child's life is measured in a disease that is so novel, we actually don't have data on what it costs. I mean, I'm trying to figure out where when we go from technology to drugs in kids or patients, when does this really surface as an issue for all these novel technologies that are swirling about?
Yeah, and again, this is, for what I do, which is one small piece of our broader healthcare ecosystem. For what I do, the dominant variable one needs to look at if they're solving the financial equation is probability of success, right? So for us, you're exactly right. We're not always, the early investors in any given therapeutic are not always the same ones who hold the equity, hold the stock when the drug gets approved. So for us, we're often looking at, when does one really know there will be a product here, right? We're usually investing when there's a slide deck and a dream is what we usually say. Hopefully there's like some really good academic publications as well. But at some point along that development path, it becomes clear that, there's a good probability this will become an approved product at some point, right? that's the delta that we're really working with, because we're not always carrying these things to a regulatory approval. But I think that's a part of this ecosystem that's really important. What we're trying to do in therapeutics is risky, right? We're working with human biology, which is, I would argue, harder than rocket science, right? We know where Mars is going to be in 2026. Human biology is still very, very, very much unworked out, not worked out. And so it's risk. And so we're taking our piece of risk, and we ultimately hand it off to someone else who's going to take a different piece of risk and look at it differently. So I think it's important that this whole ecosystem works together.
Leah, can I bring it back to you? You took it on the chin and started for us, but then you heard these other three speakers make some very good points. From the patient perspective, how do you respond to sort of what Lynette and Walt and Michelle said?
Yeah, a few different things. So I think, when I'll start with our community. So there's about just over 8 million individuals in the United States that live with psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. And if you look at folks that were diagnosed with psoriatic disease 20, 30, 40 years ago, what you typically see is individuals who experienced significant challenges. At the time they were diagnosed, they probably had phototherapy, possibly with coal tar, and really very little else that they could utilize to treat their psoriasis. Fast forward 20 years ago, we had the first biologic approved in our space. Today, there are dozens of therapies available at all levels of disease severity, approved for pediatric patients on up through adults. And it's an amazing story, an amazing journey of innovation in psoriatic disease. And yet, if you talk to someone in our community who has cycled through half of the dozen of therapies available for someone with severe psoriasis, what you hear still is this significant desire to see a robust pipeline, because in their experience, they've typically gone on a treatment, had a 1.5 or 2 years of good response, started to have efficacy wane, and then had to go off that treatment and start something new. And in many cases, interestingly enough, patients will know there's a treatment that's something they'll probably respond to very well, and they won't take it. They'll hold it off, kind of off on the side as an option when they get really desperate, because they don't want to exhaust all of their options and know that there's nothing else that they can do. They don't want to go back to that time when they had significant disease coverage, were stigmatized, had all of these other implications of living with severe psoriasis beyond the significant physical ones. And so it's really a reminder, I think, from the perspective of the individual living with the disease and their family members, because I should add that about 88% of people that live with and love someone that has psoriatic disease report the same high levels of anxiety and depression as their family member that lives with psoriasis. So it really is truly a shared family challenge. I think it's a great kind of experience example of the very personal desire to see innovation continue, even in disease states where we've had significant progress and discovery in the last few decades.
I love how you just did what Mark talked about in the top, which was you threw in a statistic, and it's a powerful one. That I'm going to go and do a survey so I can copy you.
Mike, can I just jump in right there?
Please, sorry.
I just want to underscore one of the things that Leah said that I think is so critical. When we think about testing a drug at the Food and Drug Administration, I'm a former FDA official, you think about testing the safety and efficacy on day one, but you don't take into account this kind of serial efficacy that is the trajectory of most patients with chronic or life-threatening. And so we have to keep that in mind, because FDA is not keeping an eye out often for when efficacy extinguishes for an individual patient. And yet that is so critical. And that also means that it's not being taken into account in a lot of the value assessments. So this is a topic I think we need to dig into more, not necessarily right now, but as a community that's trying to improve value.
100%. So Michelle, you said something that I was just going to ask you to double click on a little bit. You said, very different socioeconomic groups value different things. And then when confronted with this idea of these innovative therapies, it's sometimes helpful to offer examples of what we mean by innovative. It can also take us down rabbit holes, and everyone's got a story about something that might rhyme with what was just said. But can you give us some examples of what that might look like in ways that people might not be top of mind?
Yeah, the most obvious differences track more to socioeconomic than racial and ethnic, although racial and ethnic groups can track to sometimes to different socioeconomic groups and different demographics in terms of where they live, rural versus urban. So for example, if you're a young working mother who doesn't have the ability to take time off, and but you're facing a life-threatening disease, you may value a therapy that gives you freedom from coming into the clinic. You may value a therapy that is going to extend life, even if at all costs. You may value something that reduces your depression so that you can be more available to your children. If you are a grandparent living in a rural setting, you may value simplicity in a dosing regimen. You may value something that is not going to require injections that are difficult when you have fragile skin and difficult to access veins. There's a whole variety, as many varieties as there are of people and situations in which they live. There's a variety in terms of what they value, and we saw this at FDA when we started conducting patient preference studies. When you look at the population level of a patient group, so not an individual, not an anecdote, not a few stories put together, but a population level survey, you get a very, very different view of the side effects, the symptoms, the desires of what patients want. And you can stratify them by demographics, by socioeconomic, by geographic location. And so we need to make sure that we're reflecting that as we are counting on value. And unfortunately, traditional clinical trials that are conducted for approvals at FDA are notoriously undiverse. So if you're conducting your value assessment based solely upon those clinical trials, de facto, you are going to be erasing that level of granularity that you need. By one estimate, the Alzheimer's trials that were conducted up until last year over the previous 10 years had some of the lowest diversity rates of any clinical trials. Somewhere I can't remember if it was 1% or 10%, but there was a JAMA paper actually analyzing them at the meta level. It's worth looking up. I'll try to find the link. But when you dug into some of the exclusion criteria, it was clear why. They excluded people who had cerebral vascular disease. They excluded people who had heart disease. They excluded people who didn't have a dedicated caregiver who could be available at all times. And so if that's how you're going to judge the value of a therapy, you are going to miss 90% of the patients. Forget about minorities and small underrepresented groups. You're going to miss 90% of the patients that are going to rely on that therapy when it comes to market. And so we really need to make sure we're taking those sorts of variations into account.
I think it's
Mike, if I could just jump in
and
and build off what Michelle was just talking about. So National Psoriasis Foundation does these annual payer conversations, these payer roundtables, and we actually hold two. One's kind of got an education focus, and the others has a policy focus. And in mid-September, we held our education conversation, and we had an expert from the University of Pennsylvania who's an expert in psoriasis and skin of color, talking to payers about some of the challenges, different segments of our community experiences. And we got into this conversation actually about kind of what are some examples of where different populations might have different treatment needs. And the two that we spent the most time talking about with these payers were, First, with systemic treatments, many of them in our space require refrigeration. And for the unhoused patient or the patient without a stable home environment, what this clinician was sharing is that she's learned she actually has to ask the question before proceeding down the typical formulary route of, do you have the ability to receive a shipment that needs to be refrigerated, and to refrigerate that until your next dose? Because for that patient that doesn't have that option, even if that treatment is more efficacious than, for example, an oral treatment, that oral treatment might be the better option if it doesn't need to be refrigerated. The other example we were talking about for patients with more mild disease is that many of us live with scalp psoriasis. I do myself, and there's a lot of different treatment options. But some of them require you to put on kind of an oily treatment that needs to be washed out of your hair every day. If your treatment or your personal beauty care regimen is not to wash your hair daily, that sort of an approach is not going to be one that works for you. And so having those conversations about what type of hair you have, and if that's something you're interested in doing as part of your care routine every day, are so important before we go down, again, kind of the typical treatment path that many patients are kind of funneled into when there's a number of options available.
Mike, I was just going to note one piece following up on what Michelle said. I think it's important to note this trade-off that exists in our system. You know, we do placebo-controlled clinical trials because we want to have a nice, tight experiment that's testing one hypothesis, ideally one hypothesis, and it's going to tell us whether this therapy actually hits an endpoint, makes a difference in someone's life, right? I mean, I think the regulators really value that. I mean, we've really come to appreciate that in our system, and that's completely at odds with this idea of embracing variance, right? Regulators hate variance, payers hate variance. And so there's a tension there that, you know, exists in our system that I think you know is really hard to figure out how to get away from, because I think we value different people, you know, we value it, and yet the system we have doesn't enable both.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that really good point is we value it, payers value it, regulators value it, but then we act surprised that when a therapy gets released on the market, it doesn't have the same levels of efficacy as we saw in these pristine artificial trials. So I think what we should be valuing most is studies that are going to reflect the reality of the therapy once it is used. Because if it's not reflective of the reality, and it's incredibly expensive and time consuming to produce, and puts patients in, you know, the horrible position of, you know, am I on a placebo, am I not, the risk of being in a clinical trial, then I think it's worth us asking ourselves, what value is this providing? And is there a better way? And given the tools, particularly that Lynette's talking about with remote monitoring and digital tools and real world evidence, there are other options available. And we need to double down on making those a reality.
Yeah, actually, to sort of join in on that, so many good comments, but I'm curious what you folks think of the potential for sort of artificial intelligence, machine learning as, you know, it sounds so cold and hard, but a way to really help patients and their clinicians predict, you know, so you're not banking hope, you know, and holding back on treatments that might work, but really have a deliberate way to look at personalization. And then I see a lot of those kind of technologies come through, and there are companies that are starting to successfully deploy those, like if you're like Bioformis, using those both in clinical trials, but also in care to try to titrate and choose medications. And I think there's a lot of promise there. I just think like this variation in impact that we talk about, variation in access, that seems like convenience is like this fun, frivolous afterthought. But holy smokes, if patients cannot get to the clinic, then that is not going to be a solution for them, or they can't, you know. So I think that sort of weighting, whatever framework y'all develop, ultimately has to have that, you know, variation in impact and accessibility to be a real weighting factor. And some of these other things, like, will patients use it? I just got back from a payer conference on digital innovation, and it was 3 days of people talking about patient engagement in an app or a program as the be all and end all that tied to payment. And I thought, well, who's doing the work of showing how these map to outcomes that matter to patients? We're not there yet, and it's being all sort of pushed to these, frankly, startups, right, that are undercapitalized to do this type of work. So, I mean, I know we talked in our prep call about who's responsible for getting these data, who's responsible for these longitudinal patient records. And, you know, I think we do a good job at Dime in our small sort of microcosm of bringing the FDA and payers to the table very, very early on, and, you know, forcing them to say, well, what really matters and what are you going to agree on, so that we do have that harmonization. Yeah, just some thoughts.
Let me kind of respond to your question on AI ML and really ask you another question, which is AI ML is as good as the data you feed it, right? And broad strokes. And I think a lot about, and Michelle, from the FDA lens too, you know, we have digital tools give us such an opportunity to generate so much data from patients, right? Which could feed AI ML, which could inform trials. But as I alluded to at the top, there's one company that's working with us, and we are not the National Psoriasis Foundation. I have 400 patients in the US and thousands who are not diagnosed. And because, you know, access to genetic testing is so far been grossly inequitable, my patient population is like 3% of color as opposed to 50. And so lots of problems there. But I want to think about, like, how do we, I don't want to make this a data conversation, but how can we most effectively take advantage of all the data that's happening and use it to inform these trials? Because I'm literally, being the head of a very small patient group, I have the luxury of being in the room with biotechs who are developing therapies right now and pulling on all these threads, but getting people to think about how we're going to design these trials for medicines that don't exist yet, for diseases that people barely understand, for tools that are brand new. What's the way to get this innovation recognized and then actually used by FDA? I mean, Walt's point is a good one about trials, but, you know, we do have some gold standards that people like to map to. And how do we move people forward to embrace what's possible now? So it's kind of a loaded question, Lynette, but I'm just curious, and Michelle, if you guys have thoughts.
Oh, no, go ahead, Lynette.
That is a big question. Back to the collaboration up front from the very beginning. I'm going to reference again, I have to, because I'm not an expert in all these fields, that work that my colleagues did. We host a collaborative community with the FDA on digital measurement, and it's we put together a playbook on how do you ensure diversity, equity, inclusion, and development of measures that are, you know, that you are using in clinical trials, and it's getting everybody in the room to agree on what's important and how you're going to measure it. But I want to pass this to Michelle. Really interested to hear what you say. I'll put a link to this in.
Yeah, you know, it was interesting, Mike, to hear you refer to the gold standard. You know, it's a 50-year-old gold standard. There's very few gold standards that stand for 50 years. They become obsolete as the technology improves. And I've said before that the dirty little secret at FDA is that randomized placebo-controlled trials do not reflect clinical reality. So while they may be some laboratory gold standard, they should no longer be the gold standard of what we're trying to measure, because what really matters is the true rate of complications you're going to see or side effects you're going to see, and the true rate of efficacy you're going to see once it's actually used by a physician in the field. The head of the Center for Devices used to say that, you know, once devices are actually in use, they're in the wild, and you see a completely different profile than in the pre-market profile. The gold standard should be matching the pre-market profile of safety and efficacy to the post-market profile of safety and efficacy. And if what you're using is not predictive, then it's not useful. So how do we get FDA to embrace some of these new technologies? They are notoriously slow. to embrace new technologies. I mean, you look at the fight over Alzheimer's drugs over this last 12 months with Alduham coming under fire for using CAT scans to identify patients that should most likely respond to therapy and for staging disease. It's really a debate around the diagnostic tools that were being used. And yet now we're seeing that it really tracked clinical outcomes with this latest drug that just released its results last few weeks ago from IVI that shows that the hypothesis was correct. So despite all of our hand wringing and consternation, the science has shown that diagnostic is very useful. We should be shortening that latency period between the introduction of a new diagnostic, whether it's a remote monitoring tool or nocturnal itching, whatever that diagnostic parameter is, and its adoption by FDA. And I always believe in aligning incentives. And I think while our startup may feel like they don't have the resources necessarily to conquer some of this, they and their investors should realize that they have an incentive to identify the widest patient population possible that might benefit from a therapy, and making sure that it's as representative as possible, just so that they aren't missing part of their market. And this is something we have to make sure we continue to encourage.
And to add to that, like you said, making sure the FDA is on board identifying these, but the payers are also accepting whatever measure. If you say that this measure is meaningful to patients and tag that down the road, that payers will accept that as a measure, and we don't have unintended consequences of them limiting access necessarily. But yeah, it's what was the word for it? Radical collaboration. Oh my gosh, guys, right? Why can't we be Germany? Just combine the two processes.
So I'm getting the nudge from the powers that be behind the scenes that we're about to take Q&A. I want to give Walt and Leah a chance to share last thoughts on this point before we open it up to even more questions.
Yeah, I mean, I just say that I think I'm part of the group who's a big fan of the FDA. I think they have an incredibly hard job, and even worse than having an incredibly hard job, they're stuck and with what Congress allows them and tells them to do, which good luck. But I think, they have real problems they'd love to tackle. The current, what's going on with the Ballot Act is a good example of it. And their hands are just completely tied by Congress. So it's not as simple as just regulators X, Y, or Z. Now, I will say, though, that I find that the agency is very reactive, right? We're still operating on an Orphan Disease Act of 1983, right? CFTR, the causal component of cystic fibrosis, wasn't even sequenced at that point, right? It's time for some updates as well. The only thing I'll add here, though, is I agree on the variance and the ability to reflect value and really provide evidence of value in a broad swath of patients. We have to do that as an investor. I think that we have to do it. It's our duty. The agency needs to start holding companies accountable for their post-marketing commitments and for their accelerated approval post-marketing commitments. I also think that it's going to be a long time before an investor goes into a very broad population. I think you'll continue to see the stepwise move of narrowly defined population and expansion. The agency needs to do their part in holding the innovators accountable for that.
Yeah, the only other thing I would just add here, just again, as an example of some of what Michelle was talking about a moment ago, if you look at individuals living with psoriasis, about a third of them will go on to develop psoriatic arthritis, and many will live with about a dozen comorbidities. So when we're talking about treating someone with severe psoriasis, it's very likely that they're also potentially someone that has joint disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and mental health implications, among a number of other things. And so you have a number of challenges at play as the treating provider. And again, we're looking at data that came out of trials without reflecting any of those comorbidities. So.
All right. Thank you. If anyone has questions, please use the Q&A. I have gotten one already. What is one step or action that your community is or can take to push for some of the change you've identified?
I'm happy to kick that off. I think, we've talked, Mike, you talked a little bit about your organization. I have shared a bit about mine. I think patient advocacy organizations, I do think, have an amazing role they can play in assisting with the collection of data. I worry that all of that responsibility, if it falls on patients, is tough, or patient advocacy organizations, especially if they aren't as robust as ours and don't have the resources to do that work. But I think we do, at the NPF, we have been around for 55 years. We have amazing relationships with the people in our community. I think we do have the ability to go out and survey the community on a number of issues, and that's something we've been doing for more than 20 years, and bring forward some of the data that's really going to impact these conversations and hopefully inform the future direction here. So I think that's something we could do. My colleague, George Gondo, who leads this data collection work, is dropping some links in the chat. And we try to publish on that data to, again, help inform the marketplace.
Yeah, I want to just give Walt a shout out. Walt, there's a lot of startups who would love to get Walt's ear. And I have the pleasure of knowing Walt because he keeps coming to patient advocacy conferences and is always very available to us and engaged with the patient community. But I'm just curious, Walt, why do you give us so much time? Like through your lens, why do you invest so heavily in getting to know the patient voice and just sort of follow on to that conversation?
I mean, if you want to change someone's life, how do you propose to do that if you don't understand it? Like you got to understand the problem you're trying to solve. I mean, I've appreciated getting to know you, Mike, but it's also a bit, selfish. Like if I want to be good at my job, I got to understand the change we're trying to create.
Yeah, no, I need you to be good at your job.
I mean, we've had a lot of really good discussions about, what lands on the patient and patient voice and quantifying it. But at the end of the day, it starts with just, a very emotional, understand the problem.
Yep. I've got chat and Q&A. I'm just like, my screen has gotten very busy. And I agree with you, Leah, about what you said. The burden to us to capture all the data on patient voice and to communicate it, it's a big ask. And I think whether it's digital tools or something else, but it's essential. We have to bring it out. Question here from another question in the chat. Yes, Jennifer, if you want to chime in, but I'll read this one. What about the view of underrepresented populations? How can we include the perspective of underrepresented patients in the assessment of value of innovation while we still don't do a good job in including them in clinical trials?
Yeah, so I'll jump in there. It's going to take a confluence of work at the advocacy level, work at the policy level, changing the way we educate and incentivize physicians and clinicians, and work by the private sector. We have, for example, at BIO, we've started a powerofparticipation.org website that describes what it's like to participate in a clinical trial to a lay audience and helps direct patients to potential clinical trials. So that is, and I'm sitting here with our head of patient advocacy, and the website is ctpop.org. And those sorts of efforts are really, really necessary to make sure we're raising the awareness. But we also have in our bioequality agenda, a whole set of clinical trial diversification priorities, some of which were included in the user fee legislation, but unfortunately didn't make it through the final lap. So there's policy work that needs to be changed. There's so much to do. But I'm happy and buoyed by the interest and attention that it's receiving. I think that's the first most important step.
If I could just add, I think one thing that is really critical here is this presumes that the patient actually has a diagnosis. And I think we have to make sure that all individuals in our communities are getting an accurate diagnosis. There is historically a discussion of psoriasis as being a disease that presents on the skin as a red or silvery patch, when if you have darker skin type, it might look more purple or brown and present very differently. And so we have a lot of providers who don't have confidence in their psoriasis diagnosis or skin diagnosis for someone with darker skin. And so I think, that starts with medical literature, very few medical textbooks, have actually pictures of people with darker skin types. Dr. Junko Takeshita at the University of Pennsylvania has done a lot of work in this area and looked at this issue. And so we need to educate providers about the way different diseases present across different populations, so that we're starting with that accurate diagnosis so that they can then take advantage of the treatment options or trials in their space.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and to your point, if we're starting to use, clinical decision support tools, making sure that different skin colors or different populations are included in those algorithms, garbage in, garbage out. I'm really thinking, and it's in this early stage, but decentralized trials and digitized trials have the potential, I think, I worked at the Hutch in Seattle. Getting to Seattle to do a clinical trial is a really big lift. And if you're automatically excluding most of the population to be able to get there. So, even simple things like that, to be able to make it easier and more accessible for people to participate in research as part of their daily lives, not a full-time job, because it does feel like a full-time job sometimes. I was in cancer trials myself, so
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm gonna wrap us up here and give everybody a break. I want to thank the panelists.
Well, Mike, can I say one thing?
Yeah, I was gonna do last shots, but go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, I think we talked a lot over the last 45 minutes or so. We've talked a lot about the challenges and the issues. But I also think it's just a good for us all to remember as we leave. There's a lot of great things happening as well. I'm not going to sit here and argue it's perfect. The last 45 minutes is good evidence of that. But there's a lot of great progress that does happen every day around us, and that should be celebrated as well. I'm not saying give up on making it better, but it's incredible how much we see and how grateful I am to work at a place and be in a community where people fundamentally go to work trying to help other people, right? I take that as a really good part of our industry and what we do, and I just want to make sure we don't leave having only talked about the challenges.
Yep. Point taken. There's a lot of cool innovation, but how do we value it, and how do we make sure that all the people we want to help benefit from it is equitably is the other side of that. I will follow up with all of you. I've learned a lot. Thank you so much for being on this panel. And Walt got a closing shot in. Just last thoughts briefly. Leah, Michelle, Lynette, and then I'll call it good. Going once.
It's all about the patients and serving the patients, and every flavor of patient that's out there is important.
Yeah, and I would agree with Walt. I think we are certainly hugely optimistic. If you had asked me about the future, I would be talking about a cure and the possibilities of really even going beyond the progress that we've had in our space. And I think the movement to better bring the patient to the center of this work has been fantastic. And I think this conversation really has helped us to identify those next places we need to focus as a group.
Great. Thank you all. Okay. Lynette, you've said your bit. All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike.